Now you know how to sharpen the last edge of the knife. I'm going to talk about thinning of the knife. It is as important part of the sharpening job as the last edge sharpening. Most knives are constructed in this way. It's got a kind of thick spine and it tapers down all the way to the edge and edges this about, say, a millimeter, half millimeter, or even thinner part of the last part of the knife. That is the part that actually cutting into the food. But as important as the last edge, the thickness right above the edge is also very important. When it comes to cutting into something like potatoes, carrots, yams, daikon, thicker knives, what we'll do is to try to wedge them, and often they will break the food. Having a very thin behind the edge will make cutting so much smoother, cleaner, and also, believe it or not, it will make the food taste better. So the sharpening the last edge for the first few times should be fine. If you never thin the edge, it will end up cutting like this. Here's how you can successfully thin the knife. These are the gears that I'm going to use today. One, I'm going to use Knifewear 220 grit stone. You can use any of the very coarse grit stone, but I like this one. It cuts very fast and also it doesn't leave deep scratches. This 220 coarse stone, it will thin the edge, and you want to get to the as thin of the edge with this stone. This will build the foundation. If you're not grinding away enough steel with this stone, you've been spending so much time with this process afterwards. Then I'm gonna use this 1000 stone from Naniwa. This is pretty good, nice and soft. It is pretty fast and also takes all the scratches off from 220 stone that I previously used. Because it's relatively soft, it hides a little bit of imperfection as well. And thirdly, I'm going to use the Naniwa Super Stone 3000 grit. Relatively easy stone to get really shiny finish along the hardcore steel and leaves the nice foggy finish on the soft steel. I have this Atoma diamond plate. This is very important tool of any sharpenings. This stone is to true or to flatten your stone, and keep the stones nice and flat is really key for the success. Last but not least, I have this leather strap to strap away the last bit of burrs with. Alrighty, first of all, I would like to protect the handle as I always do. I'm just gonna wrap that in the plastic. And a little bit of masking tape. Thinning basically means, especially for the knives like this, knife with primary bevel. What I'm going to do is to sharpen this whole bevel and make it thin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this knife relatively flat on the stone and grinding this whole bevel until it gets nice and thin. Where you're doing anything, you want to make sure that this knife is actually true or straight. I'm gonna check that, and if there's any slight bent or something, it's not the end of the world. You can fix it. You can watch the video on how to straighten the knife, but it's got a little bit of warp, so I'm just fixing it to straight. Coarse 220 grit. I just splashed a little bit of water. Basic step is really to put this knife down flat on the bevel, on the stone like this, and you put the pressure on this bevel. You don't ever put the pressure right here because you're grinding at the this flat part. Right here, and do back and forth. You want to put the relatively firm pressure because you are grinding quite a bit of the steel away. What I'm saying is that you're grinding this whole bevel, not just a millimeter of the edge, right? So you want to put firm, but not too hard so that it impedes the ability to move around like this. I have seen people put in too much pressure like this and it just does this. You want to make sure it just flows And you can do it by sections. If it's your first time doing this, you can do it from the tip. It's either or. You can do from the tip or from the heel. It doesn't matter which you start from, but you can do by sections. As you're getting really used to it, you can flow your fingers like this. You can just move your finger while you are moving with your right hand back and forth. So as you can see, it's been touched on the stone and it's got a little subtle scratches along the bevel. You can still see the micro bevel along the edge, about a millimeter or a half millimeters. So my goal is to thin the bevel so that you don't see this micro bevel barely. Generally speaking, lots of knife makers, they make the bevel a little bit more convex instead of super straight. So you could apply the pressure in 2 or 3 different spots. In this case, I will apply the pressure a little bit more towards the edge, pretty close to the edge like this first, then apply the pressure a little bit more higher on here, along, I guess, like the bevel side. I'm just gonna keep going, applying the pressure just along the edge to make sure I get that nice and thin edge here. As I mentioned on the gear section, 220 stone is building a foundation. You want to make sure this knife gets thin as close to the final results as possible. I am getting really close to the final results, so as you can see, if you look at the very last edge of this knife, you can still see the very subtle micro bevel. But if you compare that to the other side that has not been done, you can see about a half millimeter of the bevel. That means I'm getting as thin of the edge on the one side as I would like to. So I'm going to actually switch the side because I will still grind this knife with 1000 grit and finish with 3000 grit. It is not as much steel you're taking off with a 220, but you're still taking, fair bit amount of steel. As I said, put it flat, almost, then do back and forth. Again, you can do it by sections, like this, mid and heel. Make sure it touches on the stone pretty nicely. Depending on the knife maker, this Yukihiro Sakai-san makes it a little bit more flatter. Some knife makers make it a little bit more stronger convex. Just follow the convexity of the knife that you have. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit more pressure along the edge. Pretty firm grip, firm pressure. You could, if you're not comfortable, you can certainly do this. If you want to see how convex your knife bevel is, you can do on the spice sections, and you can see which part of the knife has the scratches by the stone. Often the knives with the bit more convexity, they only touches on one part of the knife, usually in the middle. The micro bevel is almost gone. There are several ways that you can tell if the knife is thin enough at this first stage. Look at the micro bevel. If it gets really, really small and almost like fading, that's usually a good indication. Also, you can take out a carrot or potatoes and try cutting the carrot with the knife that you just thinned with just 220 grit. That will tell you how thin the knife is. Alrighty, so now I'm done with this 220 grit. I'm moving on to almost like a polishing stage. What happens when you finish your thinning with just a 220 grit stone? Because the 220 grit stone is very coarse, when you're cutting into some food, it will grab it so much more. It's like driving on a gravel road. So it pulls tags a lot more than ideal. I go up on a few steps to make sure not only it slides them very nicely, but it also works the best. Basically same idea as 220 grit. Put it flat first and I just focus a little bit more on the edge part first. So as you can see, I just worked on it very close to the edge, so about say 1/4 inch or about 3 or 4 millimeters from the edge is a little bit more polished up than the other parts. And if you compare that to this side, it's a little bit more obvious. That means I'm just working on mainly 2 sections, very close to the edge and a little bit higher up. So something very interesting is that when I'm working on very close to the edge, which is the hard core steel, and then when I'm working on the little bit more cladding part of the steel, sound changes. Oh, this. Most of the deep scratches are gone and blended in very nicely. I'll do the comparison to the other side that I haven't touched. So I'm just gonna do the other side. So this shows very nicely, I think. I'm almost done on the most of the parts except here. You see that the light is kind of weird reflection right now. So that tells me that this part needs a little bit more work. So I'm just going to focus. At home, you don't have to polish it from this on, but since we have a resource, we are going to make this edge a little bit more shinier. It's the same thing. Make sure your pressuring point is pretty close to the edge or the core steel, so it polishes the core steel really nicely. As you probably noticed, the stone is really, really quiet because, I guess, it is so much more finer than the previous 2 stones. This here is the Naniwa Super Stone 3000. But it's great, it's nice and soft, so it polishes up very nicely, as well as the leaving that the softer steel part really nice and foggy. So here, just finished with the 3000 Naniwa Superstone. It's got a really nice polish along the core steel, a little foggy on the softer steel. It really depends on type of steel that they were made out of. You can definitely explore. I noticed that the little bit of along that the shinogi or that this line, it polished up a little bit more as well. Because this is white one carbon steel, it may have made the outer steel a little bit hard too. This is 1000, 3000. I'm gonna try that. The little shiny part, a little bit more cloudy, as there are more mud here. It's just really the looks. It does not do anything for the function of the knife. If you want to know how to get this finish in more detail, check out the video how to do the 3 different finishes. So from here on, it's not done yet. You still want to finish the last bit of the edge. But because we've already thinned the knife enough, it's not going to take that long. All you have to do is to set the angle, like say 15 degrees, do a few passes. Usually it's good to start from say 1000 grit. You don't have to go back down to say coarse 220 or 400. Then finish it at any stones that you like. If you want to learn other sharpening techniques that we haven't covered, leave us in comments. We're probably gonna make the video for you. Something very interesting is that when I'm just working on along the